Imagine, if you will, a podcast. A podcast beyond that which is known to man. It exists in both fandom and discovery, in viewing and critiquing. My name is Matt Hurt. This is Anthology. Hello and welcome to Anthology, presented by ObsessiveViewer.com. If this is your first time listening, Anthology is a podcast exploring science fiction anthology storytelling during television's first golden age, beginning with The Twilight Zone. Each podcast, I share my thoughts on an episode of this iconic series as a first-time viewer, as well as share some trivia about the episode. I then end each podcast with a bonus review of a movie or show related to the week's episode. You can find more of Anthology at anthologypod.com, and if you want to contact me, you can like the Facebook page at facebook.com/anthologypod, tweet me at obsessiveviewer, send an email to matt@obsessiveviewer.com, or call and leave me a voicemail at 317-762-6099. If you like what you hear and you want to support the podcast, the easiest way to do that would be to head over to iTunes and leave a rating and review. The more ratings and reviews I get, the easier it will be for people to find my show in the highly competitive film and TV podcast category on iTunes. And if you're feeling particularly generous and you want to support the Anthology with your wallet, there's a donate button on anthologypod.com and a link in the show notes of this episode. Those show notes, of course, can be found at anthologypod.com/033. Every donation made using the donate button goes directly toward the fees to keep the podcast running and is incredibly appreciated. So today's a special episode of the podcast. I have finished reviewing season 1 of The Twilight Zone at long last. It was a really fun experience and everything, and I'm super glad to be able to move on to the next season. And this episode is kind of exists in a weird interim between season 1 and season 2. I'm taking a little bit of a brief break to kind of get my season 2 stuff up and running. And in that break, I'm bringing on a guest to review one of Serling's early TV works. It's The Time Element, an episode of Westinghouse Desilu Playhouse that aired in 1958. It wasn't the pilot episode of The Twilight Zone, but it was the first thing that Serling attached the name The Twilight Zone to. It was kind of a presentation that was bought by CBS and eventually led to them purchasing The Twilight Zone and getting it off the ground. And as I said, to review this with me, I have a guest. It's my friend Tiny. He's the co-host from The Obsessive Viewer. And Tiny, how you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Maddie.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for being here on your mom's birthday.
It is my mother's birthday, yes.
Yeah. Do we want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, to anyone who's thinking I'm an a-hole because I'm recording a podcast instead of spending the day with my mother, mm-hmm. I did see her today. I had the day off from work. I helped her set up a Shutterfly account. So,
oh, there you go.
I'm like a great son.
Sure.
Not
Great.
really. I mean,
well, we will be sure to give listeners plenty of time to figure out how they can think of you as an asshole.
Yeah.
The rest of this episode.
Just bide your time.
Yeah.
It'll come up.
Yeah, but thank you for being here. And listeners to the podcast may recognize Tiny's voice from The Obsessive Viewer, which is my main podcast that Tiny and I host. And I hawk every single episode in Anthology with a brief clip from. So you've probably heard his voice before, unless you skip that section of the podcast every single week. And Tiny, just since you're my guest on this podcast, this is a weird dynamic for us because we're usually together in the same podcast, but now It's like
I've been demoted.
Well, in this case, yeah. So since I shamelessly promote Obsessive Viewer each week, why don't you give us a few words, like in your words, pitch The Obsessive Viewer to listeners, just really briefly, and then we can move on to talking about your experience with The Twilight Zone.
Okay. Well, The Obsessive Viewer is the greatest movie and TV podcast on the internet forever, all time.
Wow. You were reading that teleprompter so well.
No, like Matt says, it's a weekly and movie TV podcast. We've been doing a lot of reviews lately, which has been really great. And it's we've been talking about Rogue One and Westworld and all that stuff. That's been a lot of fun, and we like to focus every once in a while on a topic like detective movies or rom-coms or something like that. So we like to mix it up in that respect. So if you're into that kind of stuff, more up to date, or I guess new things that come out every week, check out the Obsessive Viewer.
That is such a great pitch, and you can find Obsessive Viewer at obsessiveviewer.com. And all right, let's stop with the circle jerk here.
I'll expect my residual check in the mail.
Yes, you will get paid for that ad spot. So let's go ahead and get into this. Before we get to the actual time element episode, I kind of want to get some conversation going with you about your experience with the Twilight Zone. I've brought it up on the Obsessive Viewer a few times, and we've talked about it a little bit there. But honestly, I don't know what your history is with the Twilight Zone, if you've watched it as a kid or if you watched it, if you had any experience before I kind of shoved it down your throat for several weeks on the podcast. Especially I'm thinking of when I brought up Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. I kind of essentially almost forced you to watch that episode. So what's your history with the Twilight Zone?
Well, to use your phrase, I really needed it shoved down my throat because as a big fan of sci-fi and a big TV fan, I should be well versed in the Twilight Zone, but for whatever reason, I'm not. I think the advent of Netflix has really helped people access the Twilight Zone in a very good way, and that's true for me as well. My past with the show is, like I said, it's unfortunately barren. I've seen a few episodes here and there. I saw one or two as a kid. The one I saw, I don't recall. It's almost like I've repressed it from my memory because it scared the crap out of me.
Nice.
I was like 9. And so that was my first, like my introduction to the Twilight Zone. It just scared the crap out of me that I've had like an odd relationship with it ever since.
Nice.
But I've started to watch it since you started this podcast, and it's really good. And I really need to sit down and watch through all of it because it's so... It has such a foundation for science fiction. Like there is so much science fiction that all of us take for granted after the 1960s that it was inspired by this TV show. And so it's something that I need to consume and digest and work through and experience, and I haven't yet. And I'm glad that you're forcing me into it, handcuffed and bruised.
That's an exaggeration, but yeah, no, yeah, that's great. And it's really interesting. That's what I'm finding with doing this podcast is that I'm discovering and I've said this before, I'm sure on this podcast, but it's like I'm slowly discovering one of my new absolute favorite shows of all time.
Nice.
And it's just really jaw dropping. How the caliber of writing and the production of the show, it's really incredible how well it holds up. And I'm so glad that I picked this show to do a solo podcast about, and not a show that maybe wouldn't have endured quite a bit, quite as much as the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, I wanted you to do iCarly. I don't know why you went for the Twilight Zone instead of that.
Yeah, that podcast is coming. I'm struggling to think of a funny word for, or a funny title for it. So unfortunately, I'm at a loss there.
That'll be the next golden age that you tackle.
It will be, yeah, exactly.
It'll be iCarly and Glee.
Right, yeah, iCarly, Glee, Hannah Montana,
The Bee in Apartment 23.
Yeah, I've actually heard good things.
Which actually isn't a bad show. I watched some
what
of
I've
it.
heard.
Moving on.
Anyway, okay, so yeah, so that's cool. That's your history with the Twilight Zone. I'm glad that I can, influence someone to watch anything really at this point. So that's cool. What's your favorite episode of Anthology that you've heard? Because you've listened to every single one, right?
Everyone are just etched into my memory.
Nice.
I've only listened to like 2 or 3.
Oh, that's cool.
It's because I haven't watched a lot of the show yet, and I need to watch it before I listen.
And hey, that's totally fair.
I love the format, though. I like what you do.
Great.
I like how you give us information about it, and I'm a big fan of history, and you always start out with some history.
Nice.
So I appreciate
thank you.
that.
I wasn't fishing for that, but and I understand. Yeah, you haven't watched the show that much.
Yeah.
But I mean, you spent a lot of time the last couple days watching Black Mirror, right? And I do a bonus episode about Black Mirror. So how many of those have you listened to?
Again, just laser etched into. I haven't.
Oh, well, that's
because
great.
you couple them with a Twilight Zone episode that I haven't seen yet.
I don't actually at all.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. The Black Mirror episode is the Black Mirror bonus episodes are.
Oh, they're just Black
Only
Mirror.
Black Mirror,
Okay,
yeah.
see, I didn't even know that.
See, yeah, and that's great. I'm suddenly regretting having you on. No, I'm kidding. But no, with that knowledge, you can go back and listen to
I
them.
can.
Yeah. So we'll pause the podcast while you do that.
Okay, see you in 3 weeks.
All right. No, okay. So we're here today to review the time element, and it's funny because you just mentioned that I always have history and trivia and stuff, but in this case, since this is a special episode and I kind of have a guest here to play off of, I'm kind of not. I guess I'm going to kind of forego the trivia. I may record it later and tack it on to the episode if I feel like it. But for right now, I think that we're just going to just discuss the episode. And also because it's not really readily available anywhere. Usually these episodes, like the bonus episodes that I do for the bonus reviews in each episode that I do, or each podcast, they usually are available on YouTube, or one of the numerous streaming services. So I kind of use that as a justification for it. So I'm going to kind of treat this as, instead of being like a Twilight Zone episode review, I'm going to treat it as the bonus review. So it's going to be not really spoiler filled, in case people, since it's not that readily accessible to it. So we're not really going to spoil it. We're going to just kind of go ahead and do our whole review of it without spoiling it, essentially. So to bring us into it, I'm going to read the plot description courtesy of IMDb. Once again, the time element was an episode of Westinghouse Desilu Playhouse, an anthology show. This aired on November 24th, 1958. And it is, the premise is a man is sent back in time to December 6th, 1941, and tries to warn people about the upcoming Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. This episode starred William Bendix as Peter Jensen and co-starred Martin Balsam as Dr. Gillespie. Martin Balsam, you may remember he was in the 16mm Shrine in the Twilight Zone season 1, and he was also most known for his role in Psycho. I was very pleasantly surprised to see him pop up in this episode. So Tiny, we watched this together just about an hour ago here in my apartment. What did you think of the time element overall, and what did you go in expecting it to be? Like, I didn't tell you anything about the plot or anything. Did you look it up beforehand?
I intentionally came in dark to this. I think that's a good way I think that's a good position to come into any Rod Serling story.
Yeah.
Because you don't want preconceptions, because you never know where it's going to go anyways. I think it's fun to go in dark to his story, so I intentionally didn't look this up at all.
Nice.
And I'm glad I didn't, because it was just fun to discover along the way that there's, you just starts out with a guy in a psychiatrist's office, and it goes from there, and it's like, maybe he's going to psychoanalyze his deep past, or maybe it's going to be this or that, and it turns into something totally different. So I think I'm glad I didn't know anything going into it. This was a really great episode.
Nice.
The Twilight Zone, I love the half-hour format of it, or it's a short, quick episode. At least for the first season, does stay a half-hour long. So I really like the format of the Twilight Zone, that it's a half-hour long show. But I think it's fun to explore one of his stories in an hour, because this was an hour-long episode. So I think that it was cool fleshing some of that out and seeing more character establishment. It's fun to see his story in this kind of format instead of the half hour.
That's really interesting that you say that, actually, because in season 4 they actually went to an hour-long format.
Oh, did they? Okay.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, and again, I'm sorry if this is incorrect, but it's kind of the premise of this podcast is I don't know the Twilight Zone as I'm discovering it as I'm going through. So apologies if I have this information wrong, but if I'm not mistaken, I think that it turned to a 1 hour show, and Serling left the show that season to teach.
Okay.
Instead of work on the show, or he divided his time or something. So it's interesting that they went to an hour long format, and we didn't have quite as Serling's presence there for it. That's my understanding of it. I could be completely off base, so
Gotcha.
take that with a grain of salt.
Okay. But I really enjoyed this episode. I think it's a terrific idea for a story. I like that it's grounded to an event. You know, that is one of the most famous events in American history, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the story's grounded in that, but it's not about Pearl Harbor. So I think that's cool. I think that's a great way to ground the episode, basically, to keep driving that word home.
Sure.
It was just a really good idea, and you know, I put it together really quickly. I was like, he's in Honolulu on December 6th. Oh crap!
You actually turned to me and you said December 6th. I wrote it down in my notes.
Oh really?
You said December 6th, Honolulu. December 7th, Pearl Harbor?
Yeah.
And I was just like, I kind of played dumb. I was like, that's weird, right? You know? That's kind of weird.
Yeah. So I put that together really quick, but then, you know, the direction it takes, of course, you know, they could have just been like, yeah, we got attacked on December 7th, 1941.
Right.
But, you know, obviously Rod Serling's got to Rod Serling it. So
Right.
it was great. I really enjoyed how grounded it was. I really, really loved William Bendix. I thought he gave a great performance. He was kind of a dick.
He was.
but like in a great way. He had these really funny sayings where he would threaten people. I liked his threats. They were just so like
Very colorful dialogue.
yeah. It was good. There's some comedy in there.
Oh yeah.
It was a really good episode. I liked it a lot.
Oh yeah. That's great. And I'm so glad.
Yeah.
And I want to talk a little bit about the setup of this episode because it's really interesting to me because the kind of setup for this entire premise is that Bendix's character, Mr. Jensen, Pete Jensen, he is seeing a psychiatrist, and he's talking about how he, when he goes to sleep, he is transported into 17 years in the past on December 6th, 1941, and it's kind of presented as it's a really interesting setup because it reminds me a lot. It is very close to what would become the episode of The Twilight Zone in season 1, Perchance to Dream, which is about a man who is afraid to go to sleep because he gets transported into this weird carnival world that has this woman that's summoning him to, threatening him to his death.
Wow.
And it's every time he falls asleep, he has this vision of this. And what's interesting about that is that episode was not written by Rod Serling.
Oh, wow.
It was written by Charles Beaumont.
Okay.
And it's really interesting that they have. I don't know if I can't remember off the top of my head if Perchance to Dream was based on. I think Perchance to Dream was based on a short story that was in Playboy. Maybe I might be confusing that, but I don't know when it came out, or I don't know if one influenced the other. But it's just really interesting that they have that same concept central to it, and I have to admit I had a little bit of trouble starting out with that central premise. I kind of wish that it was just a man transported back in time, and he has a finite amount of time to prevent Pearl Harbor. I kind of think that type of time travel story itself is good enough to sustain itself through an episode of television. But when they introduced the psychiatrist thing, it kind of felt like, well, is it real? Is it not real? Can he be transported back? When he transports back, does it start a new timeline for him? Is he repeating his experience in 1941 in a kind of Groundhog Day kind of thing? So it kind of didn't bother me the way that it was set up, but it kind of wasn't what I was expecting. But I got over it, and I got more into it as the episode unfolded. But there's an early scene where Jensen is talking to the psychiatrist, and he is basically he's kind of self-diagnosing himself.
Yeah.
And I love that because I love that that's how Serling wrote it, because that is such a great way to have a character tell the audience what, like, not necessarily like what his problem is, but like what the subtext of it is, what his problem is with the world, essentially. And it's such a brilliant way to have him tell the audience to us without having a character tell us directly. Like, it could have easily been in a lesser quality script, it would have been that the psychiatrist was telling him that, and it was opening it with like, oh, hey, these are all your problems. just basically spelling it out to us in an exposition dump. But here it's really great, and it's fun the way that Serling creates that. How did you feel about Martin Balsam as the psychiatrist, by the way?
He was kind of there. He wasn't even really a guide necessarily for a majority of the episode, but I think when we get towards the end of the episode, his role really becomes obvious, I guess, or just kind of his role kind of presents itself, and it's you understand the importance of his character, and so a little bit I was like, is this whole psychiatrist thing really necessary? But by the time you get to the end of the episode, I think you can appreciate it, and I think he was there as a character to wrap up the story, and I think it was a good. It was a good thing ultimately. I'm glad that I was wrong at the beginning. That I think it was necessary for him to be at the psychiatrist office and working through it. And he's just kind of the main character. Peter Jensen's kind of just a jerk right at the beginning. He's hungover and he's treating everybody like crap, and he's kind of short with the psychiatrist. And I think his character changes throughout the episode in a good way, and so you start to empathize with him a little bit more. And so. You need Martin Balsam's character there at the end to kind of put a bow on everything, and kind of, you don't want to just. I'm trying not to spoil it, but you don't want to see his character just gone, and then there's nothing to wrap up the end of the story. So it was good that he was there, and I'm glad that was the direction it took.
I agree with you there. It's kind of interesting. There are some interesting parallels with. His character in this episode, or his character in the time element, and his character in one of the Twilight Zone episodes he was in, the 16mm Shrine. They're kind of very similar.
Absolutely
arcs there. But I kind of just freaking love Martin Balsam in really anything. He is such an amiable guy. He seems so likable and friendly, and like he is the perfect casting for a psychiatrist role that is essentially, he's supposed to be someone that a person is turning to for guidance, and he has this just kind of affable quality to him that it feels like it's not a stretch to think that Bendix's character can just open up to him there. So I really respect Martin Balsam for his performance there, because he just has a good energy to him.
Me too. He's a great character actor.
Yeah. So the main plot is that he falls asleep and he wakes up, or he's in 1941, and it's really interesting the way that they introduce that element to the plot, like the whole time travel element of it. I don't know if maybe this is the 2016 in me talking, or maybe by the time that this is posting, it would be 2017. But I don't know if it's the modern era talking in my brain. But it's interesting that this is kind of a low key time travel story. It's like there are parts where the character is trying to warn people about Pearl Harbor. He's trying to not necessarily prevent it, but he's trying to get the word out about it. But the episode isn't necessarily all about that. He seems to be, it's kind of a low effort. There are certain things that compel him to do it, but it's not like he realizes that it's the night before December 7th. I keep wanting to say 9/11.
Oh, wow.
He realizes, it's not that he realizes that it's the day before Pearl Harbor, and it's like his entire goal is to prevent it or save people. It's like he's more perplexed by it, and he doesn't really seem to. I don't know. It's not really about fighting to get the word out about it from me. Did you get any of that? How did you feel about the way that his effort or his reaction to being in like the day before Pearl Harbor? How did you think that? How did you feel about the way that played out?
Well, I think there's a shift, because towards the beginning, like I said, he's just kind of a dick.
Yeah.
And like there's a time early on in the episode where he's in one of his quote unquote dreams, and he's placing bets. He's placing bets on sporting events that he knows the answer to, or whatever, knows he's going to win.
Yeah, and there's a great bit of comic relief in that, and that he's betting on sports events that haven't even been scheduled yet.
Yeah,
which I thought was a nice touch.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it really is. It's a nice appeal to the audience's kind of like. I mean, that's kind of a prerequisite for any time travel story,
right?
Is you need that kind of thing, and I like that they incorporated it into it. But I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's cool.
I'm just used to being the only one here.
So I feel like he's very self-interested at first. But then in that moment when he's placing those bets, he has that conversation with the ensign who's assigned to the USS Arizona. And I think that conversation is a tipping point, and he realizes it's made real for him, the stakes, the grounding event or whatever, the point in time that he seems to be linked to when he goes to sleep. I guess he just kind of realizes that it's not really about him. Mm-hmm. I think. I wonder if he comes to the realization that I keep having this dream, and so I'm here for a reason, and I don't necessarily think the reason is to get rich. He never externalizes that or says that out loud, but I feel like we can see the character of Peter Jensen going through a transition and during that conversation or right after. I think he does say, there is a line where he says, these are two nice looking young kids.
Yeah.
And I don't want the wife to be a widow in the morning.
A widow after 2 days or something like that.
Right. And so I think that, that kind of brings it down to earth for him, and he realizes that he needs to do something different with his time, quote unquote, which is funny. Yeah. Funny way to put it.
Yeah. It exposes his conscience.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so for the rest of the episode, he works towards doing something about it. But this is what the Twilight Zone is so great at. There are these universal questions or scenarios that we can place each other in. Like, if you could travel back in time, where would you go to and why?
Right.
You can sit there and think about those things. And the Twilight Zone comes up with those questions and answers them in a certain way. And like, well, this is what this guy might do, or this is what this might happen. Mm-hmm. And that's really fascinating to see. How really would you try to prevent Pearl Harbor?
Right.
How would you try to save those thousands of lives? Mm-hmm. And just like, this guy tries, and it's really hard. And it's very fascinating to watch that scenario play itself out. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the strength of the episode.
Yeah, I agree. I'll agree with you. I would say that the beginning of it is kind of where I'm coming from, that he it's not his immediate goal is to stop Pearl Harbor. It's just like, he's like, oh, wow, cool. I'm in 1941. But yeah, I'll agree with you there that it does propel him, the newlywed couple does propel him to make an attempt. And let's talk a little bit about what he does, and let's not really, I mean, obviously we're trying to remain spoiler free, so let's not really go into too much detail about what exactly happens there. But I thought it was really interesting that this is, the story is being depicted as being set in 1941. It's written in 1958. It's set, the present day of the story is in 1958. And I think it's interesting to note that his first place where he goes to try to get the word out about Pearl Harbor is the newspaper. And not only is it the newspaper, but it's the newspaper on December 6th, like after 5 p.m.
Right.
And I thought that was interesting because he says the words. He says, you guys are the only, like, you guys will get the word out fastest. And I'm just thinking, like, that's really fascinating because, like, I'm sitting there thinking, like, they're taking down notes and stuff, and I'm thinking, like, I mean, they got to take it to the printer, they've got to distribute it. It's like, that's not enough time, man. But then again, I mean, this is the Twitter age, so maybe they can work that fast. But I just thought that was a fascinating thing. Did that register with you at all? Did you think that there was another way that he could have gone about it?
Yeah, that registered with me definitely because, my first thought would be go knock on the general's door or the colonel's door, or whoever. And, he says a line in the episode where he says, I don't want to have to cut through all the brass or deal with all the brass, which is a saying he doesn't want to have to work his way up the chain of command until someone finally takes him seriously. Mm-hmm. So I can understand his reasoning there. But again, what would you do? If you're in that scenario, there's no internet, there's no Twitter. You can't just call the news and be like, can you please do this? It's like, given the technology and the tools and skills available to him in 1941, the day before Pearl Harbor, how would you go about trying to prevent that? It's almost impossible, I think. And so just seeing it played out, I think what happens is a pretty realistic scenario.
I agree.
And yeah, but I mean, I think maybe going to the newspaper makes the most sense.
Yeah. Fair enough. I would think maybe radio would maybe be the best, but
you gotta get them to buy your story.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I thought that was an interesting avenue for them to go with the character and everything. And I love the response he gets. It's a very patronizing response.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite moments in terms of comic relief in the episode. But I thought that it was a good segment of the episode for me. It was a good way to kind of really bring home the hopelessness of him doing that. And there's a line of dialogue after he leaves the newspaper that I want to highlight because it is a Serling line, and it's great because it connects so well with Time Enough at Last, the episode with Burgess Meredith. But like the character of Pete Jensen says, the best played lands of mice and men and Pete Jensen, and that's like that mimics what would be the closing narration of Time Enough at Last, where Serling begins it with the best laid plans of mice and men and Henry Bemis.
Okay.
I liked that he reuses that reference point.
It's a good line.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Obviously, he's not responsible for that, but it's just nice that he has that reference point, that he reused it in an iconic Twilight Zone episode. And it's kind of interesting because at a certain point in the episode, Jensen kind of takes this. It's almost like he admits defeat, and he kind of has this morose attitude. It's kind of this interesting, not nihilism, but kind of like this fatalism to it. Like he says that he's kind of making a scene a little bit, and he just kind of says, "I don't want to give you trouble. I want to give you music," and he's referencing the jukebox and stuff, the jukebox, and it's really interesting to see how beaten down. And I don't know did it register with you that he was beaten down at that point, or was I misreading it? Because I kind of felt like he was not necessarily admitting defeat, but it's like he realized that there was no hope for him to really save everyone. Did you register? Did that connect with you that way?
Absolutely. It's the night before, like it's 8, 9, 10 hours before the bombs are going to drop, and I think you're right. I don't know that he necessarily admits defeat, but I think he's basically just grasping at straws, trying to sing the fight songs and stuff that were written after Pearl Harbor was bombed. And of course, they have no frame of reference for that, so it's not going to have any effect. But it's all he can think of at the time, and it really just displays his desperation and just lack of an idea of what to do. And he's looking at a bunch of people who are going to be dead in 8 hours or whatever. And it's one of those things where it's fast. It's one of those scenarios that, as far as we know, it could never happen. We could never have somebody in that scenario, but it's fascinating to see how the human psyche responds to that scenario. Yeah. Just being completely helpless. There's no way that you can convince people of this without looking like a nutbag.
Right.
And he's absolutely right. And that's it's you never necessarily know how someone's going to react, but I think it's going to be an act of desperation, and that's what that moment is. And I thought it was really well done. Awesome acting by William Bendix.
Yeah, I agree.
Really
completely.
Good. Yeah.
And we'll save the rest. We're still trying to remain spoiler free. But what did you think of kind of the ending of it? I do want to highlight that there was a really great moment with Martin Balsam again, where he's describing to Jensen, he's describing why the logic of time travel doesn't work. And it's kind of, at this point, it's kind of, I wouldn't say that it's dated, but it's kind of a logical explanation that kind of is just, it's just kind of a, I don't know how you would describe it really without going to spoilers. It's kind of it's a logical explanation for why it can't possibly be true that he's going back in time and physically existing in 1941. Yeah,
it's a logical explanation for a supernatural phenomenon,
exactly.
and it's for that reason it doesn't fit.
Yeah, and I like that they included that, because it's like,
Absolutely.
yeah, you have to have a reason for the psychiatrist to doubt him, or the psychiatrist to not be swept up in it. It's a logical, like, rational explanation for an irrational thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I thought it was. I liked the ending. I think it was. I liked I appreciated the abruptness of it. I think it gets to a certain point, and I was expecting a very heroic thing, or like a very grand gesture, something grand to happen, and it doesn't, which I think was a realistic result, which is a silly thing to say because we're talking about a completely fictional thing that can't really happen. But I think it was a realistic result, and I thought it was abrupt and kind of heartbreaking. You know, I wanted to see an act of heroism, and it had a very real world kind of tragic event, and I think it was really good, and I liked it, but it just kind of crushed me. I was like, man, that's a bummer. But it was very well done.
I agree. I liked the ending as well, and I thought that it was a nice cap on it, really. And they use a voiceover element to it that I like, that it's a voiceover of dialogue that was used earlier in the episode, but they distort it a little bit, and I thought that was a nice effect to it. It's slightly distorted and a little more otherworldly, the way that it's presented in that ending, and I really appreciated that.
Yep.
So I kind of want to ask you this, since we're kind of getting to the point where we're winding down a little bit, but did you find it, I guess, would you think of it as believable that, and I'm talking more in the general sense of the idea of someone being transported back in time to 1941 on the eve of Pearl Harbor, do you find it believable that people wouldn't believe him? Because, like, the whole time I'm thinking that, okay, well, here's a man, granted he has no, there's no proof or anything, there's no idea of, like, yes, this, like, everyone scoffs at him saying, like, there's no way that's going to happen. And granted, I wasn't, around in 1941, but, and I understand that, yes, it's completely, at that time, like, we weren't involved with the stuff going on, and it's kind of, I'm putting my foot in my mouth, but, it's interesting to think that back then people couldn't have fathomed that Japan would have attacked us.
Right.
But it's still, there is, the climate of the era. It's, I feel like, part of me feels like maybe it wouldn't have been completely out of the realm of possibility. Like,
yeah,
if you scream enough about it, maybe they would, keep a closer eye on things, maybe.
Right.
And that could in itself affect change. Did you believe that people wouldn't believe a raving lunatic about the Japanese attacking?
Well, I think there's a whole element of time that plays a factor in this.
There's a whole "the" too.
Yeah, but seriously, he has less than 24 hours to get this
true.
done, and
that's a good point.
I think that's the problem, and I think I feel like the culture was different back then. I feel like as a society, we're much more cynical to acts of terror, which is really what Pearl Harbor was. We're much more cynical to that now. So if some guy walked into a bar in San Francisco tonight and said, North Korea is going to launch a bomb on, December 29th, 2016, that's going to be a date that everyone remembers because the city of San Francisco is going to disappear because of a nuclear bomb being dropped on it. That's going to be hard. It might, I think people might be more receptive to that now in the information age, in the war on terror age. I think that's easier to do in 24 hours than it was in 1941. So that's something you got to look at. But I don't know. I think it would have been. There was I think there was a climax of the episode that I was looking for where he marches into Pearl Harbor at 7:00 in the morning on December 7th, and he convinces someone to leave. Like this guy puts a lot of effort in this journey back in time several times, and he gets nothing out of it, and it's unfortunate. I think it would have been a cool conclusion if he had actually saved somebody. least one person. I think that would have been a cool part of the story, and maybe at the end the psychiatrist could have called that person and talked to him, and
that would have been cool.
That would have been pretty cool. But I still think the ending was good and everything, and I'm not trying to take anything away from it. I don't want to spoil any more than I already have, but
Sure.
The way he wakes up in the morning on December 7th, I think it makes sense, and it's a logical progression. So I'm not upset with the way it turned out. But yeah, I don't know. I'd be curious to see that juxtaposition. A 2016 potential terror attack versus 1941 Pearl Harbor. Just the cultural and information and technological differences, I think, make it more of a challenge in 1941.
And that's a really interesting point, and that actually is something that I thought about a little bit too. And I was going to actually ask you a question about that, but let me try to frame this in a certain way. It's interesting to me. This is a kind of a different question entirely, but it's interesting to me that episode was written and it premiered in 1958, and this was 17 years after Pearl Harbor, and they're creating this fictionalized, science fiction based story with Pearl Harbor at the center of it, and to kind of, I guess my question is, this is bringing the conversation to a completely different arena, but here we are, we're recording this on December 28th, 2016. Here in a few days, it's going to be 2017. In 2018, we will be 17 years removed from 9/11. It's interesting to me. Is it a cultural thing? Because I don't feel like we're at a point in our culture where we could really fictionalize September 11th in a way that can make the 9/11 attacks as integral to a story the way that Pearl Harbor was to the time element, and have it be, not met with like kind of a cultural backlash. Really, how would you feel about that? A hypothetical in which, do you think that 18 years in present time is enough to create a fictionalized account of a disaster like that, versus it being 18 years between Pearl Harbor and the time element?
That's a really good question.
Years.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm curious myself, and especially to use that event, 9/11, in the way that Pearl Harbor was used for this story. You have a science fiction story where guys traveling in time, and so that story is not necessarily about Pearl Harbor. So if you could make a story where it's not necessarily about 9/11, but it plays an integral role in the plot, that would be interesting to see how that, first of all, how it's used, just how, what kind of story we get with that. And then secondly, how people would react to it. I'm sure that, again, talking about the difference in culture and societal opinions and I guess general temperament of the populace, I feel like people are a little bit more sensitive now than they were in the 1950s.
Yeah.
And so I feel like there would be, without question, a group of people who were up in arms over them, bogarting 9/11, basically,
right,
using it to tell a silly story, if you will. But at the same time, I think we've gotten a couple stories around 9/11. Like, what was the Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close with the?
Yeah,
it was used in that story in a decent way, and it was sort of used in Zero Dark 30 a little bit right at the beginning of the movie.
Yeah, it definitely played to the public reaction, really.
Right. So I think it's 9/11 as an event has been used fictitiously before, but not necerally to the extent that it was used in this episode of television with a time element. I mean, obviously you had World Trade Center, the Oliver Stone movie, but that was completely about 9/11.
Right.
So I mean, that's a little bit different.
It was more of a docudrama, really.
Right.
And also, I think that the important distinction to make here that I failed to when I brought up this hypothetical is that, I mean, Pearl Harbor and 9/11, they're significant historical events, to say the bare minimum. But also, Pearl Harbor was a military installation,
Right.
whereas the World Trade Center was civilian, hundreds and hundreds of civilian deaths.
At peacetime as well.
At peacetime, yeah. So it is, that is a little bit of a, it's not really a fair comparison for this scenario. So, I'm kind of spinning my wheels at this point, but, I think it's just interesting to see that we have two very significant tragic events, and to see where we're at in terms of time.
You're right. The details are significantly different in that. A lot of the people, most of the people who died in Pearl Harbor had signed a contract saying they're willing to die for their country. Whereas, not that they should have, obviously I'm not saying that, I'm just saying, they had a certain mental preparedness for that, that outcome. Whereas everyone that died in 9/11, they were just going to work on a Tuesday morning.
Right.
There is a significant difference there, and I think the sensibilities of the people who suffered as a result of both events, they might be more or less receptive given those factors that you just mentioned. And I'm curious to see how that would kind of play out with a similar event like 9/11. I don't know. I think I'd definitely watch it. I'd be curious to see.
I'd be very curious.
Yeah, to see how people react to that.
And what's fascinating is that I was sitting here thinking, like, let's think of the kind of watershed moments in history and everything, like the big tragic moments in our history, and like I was thinking, okay, there's 9/11, Pearl Harbor, and then also the JFK assassination, which is fascinating because we had a dramatization of a person going back in time to prevent the JFK assassination in 11/22/63. Granted, the time of that is 50 years removed from it, but it's just interesting that we have that type of story. And I really enjoyed 11/22/63, both the novel and the miniseries. So yeah.
Oh, there's a cool episode of Doctor Who where he goes to when Vesuvius erupted.
Oh yeah,
that's a cool episode as well. He goes to a lot of those. There's a lot of good examples of moments in history, or at least characters throughout history, that are exemplified in Doctor Who as well. Yeah.
Cool. And I think that we can kind of start closing it down here. Any parting thoughts on the time element in the Twilight Zone? Do you want to? For those who've listened to the Obsessive Viewer podcast where you talked about the Monsters of Do on Maple Street, do you still have those opinions about it? I mean, you didn't have negative opinions about it, but I know that it didn't really take you with it. Have you revisited it at all?
I haven't. I'm not sure how much my opinions have changed on it. I'm not sure they really have at all. But one thing I think was of note about this episode, the time element, is that it's an episode of Westinghouse Desilu Playhouse. Never had heard of that ever in my life.
Yeah.
But I just, after we watched it, and then afterwards, there's this really hokey marketing scheme,
spot.
like an ad spot, but it's built into the show. It's not even like Desi Arnaz is sitting there opening up a Westinghouse refrigerator and saying "Oh, look at all the food in this refrigerator." Really, it's I think it's kind of a fun from a marketing perspective to see where it was in the 1950s. But also I think it's kind of cool that Westinghouse just had their own show.
Yeah.
They weren't just the main sponsor. They were just it was the Westinghouse show. That's kind of cool.
Oh, absolutely. And this anthology show format like that, live performance shows like that, an anthology thing was it was prevalent. It was huge at the time, and it's really interesting. They had I'm blanking on some of the shows because they had other sponsored shows like that.
Well, it's kind of funny to think about what would be the modern equivalent of that. Would you have a Microsoft Playhouse?
Yeah, that's the thing, and that's something that I kind of lamented in some of the episodes here. There was the United States Steel Hour.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
I think it'd be cool.
Yeah. Me too.
I mean, well, we kind of have it when you think about it with Amazon. Amazon's just a retailer, and they just happen to start making TV shows.
I agree with that for sure.
But it's not called Amazon's The Man in the High Castle.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's a little bit
it sort of is, but I see what you're saying.
yeah, it's a little different.
Yeah, and also like that's a somewhat serialized, fictional show,
Right.
with its own arcs and everything. Like the thing about these, I mean, there was like Goodyear Theater.
To see an episodic Playhouse show.
Yeah, to see an anthology show presented by a corporation or a product for it. It's really interesting. That's one of the things that I am finding that I'm really fascinated by with this era of television, is that you get those moments where they are promoting the product that's sponsoring the show. And I've seen it in episodes of Tales of Tomorrow that I recorded, that I did bonus reviews for throughout the season of this season of Anthology. It's really interesting to see them like at ad breaks, they had to promote the products, or they had the promotional stuff. It's just really interesting, to see that era of television presented, like that era of television. It is totally a lost era, I think. And it's something that, like, when you think about live performances, and like this, I don't believe this show was like a live performance, but I'm thinking of, Tales of Tomorrow and Playhouse 90. Those shows were like live stage productions, that were like aired on television, and the closest you get to that really is maybe, I don't know what, SNL.
Yeah.
But those are just sketches, and it's just, I would love to see that type of television show make a resurgence. I think that would be fascinating to see.
Yeah.
With the technological advancements we've made and today's talent. I mean, I can't imagine that. Like, I can only imagine that would be a stretch of talent. So, like, it's one thing to shoot a television show and do multiple takes of a thing, but to have it air, like to have it filmed live to air, it's just, my jaw drops at it.
I think it'd be fun for like a show like Black Mirror that has episodic episodes,
right,
to have like
an anthology show,
yeah, to have a host come in at the beginning, and set up the stage, set up the scene. That'd just be, it'd be nostalgia without question. It would be playing to nostalgic emotions. But I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it'd be kind of fun if someone did that again with some kind of show.
That would be cool. And I know that there are some anthology shows, particularly episodic anthology series, because there's a distinction now, because today you hear anthology show, you think of one season stories,
right,
like American Horror Story, True Detective, stuff like that. But the actual episodic anthology shows like Black Mirror, I know that there's some coming out. I have them on my radar to do bonus episodes of, like science fiction anthology shows. Like there's one on Hulu called Dimension 404 that's going to be coming out.
Okay.
And it's from the people that do, I believe it's Rocket Jump, which is a show on Hulu, and they do web shorts and stuff. I've been kind of keeping an eye out for that, but actually one of the main guys was a guest at Indie PopCon when we were at it.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and I didn't realize it until after. Like, I would have gone up and like tried to talk to him about Dimension 404, because I'm very intrigued by it. But I think that would be an interesting thing to have someone present the story to us. That way, like the way that, anthology shows did, and the way that the Twilight Zone does. I know that starting in season 2, I think Serling introduces the episodes, but on screen. So
okay,
we'll see though.
The vintage marketing was a fun little touch that I just enjoyed. I thought that was fun.
Totally. And I'm glad that they keep that in the DVDs as
Absolutely,
well.
yeah.
Yep. So I think that'll about do it for this special episode of Anthology. And once again, thank you guys for listening. And Tiny, thank you so much for joining me today.
It was fun. I really liked this episode. It was fun.
That's great. I'm so glad you did. I was kind of worried. Well, I was nervous that you weren't going to be into it or whatever, but I was really excited to have you on to talk about it, because I mean, we do this all the time on Obsessive Viewer, and it's kind of cool to do a big crossover event podcast.
Yeah.
But yeah, so why don't you go ahead and tell people where they can find you online?
You can find me on Twitter at ObsessiveTiny. You can chat with us on the Obsessive Viewer group page. I try to participate in the comments and the the questions we have every week there. Yeah, those are the two main places. Shoot me an email if you want, or send me a DM on Twitter, something like that, if you want to talk about something or call me an idiot for a certain opinion. I have no problem with that. I'm open to criticism. So
Sure.
Yeah, it was fun to be here.
Nice. Thank you again for joining me. And of course, you can, if you do want to email Tiny, you can email him at obsessivetiny@gmail.com, or no, tiny@obsessiveviewer.com. Yeah, and I was trying to bring up the episode of Obsessive Viewer where you talked about the Monsters of Maple Street, but I can't find it. But anyway, yeah, get in touch with him if you want to. And yeah, thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you next time. I'll be starting season 2 of The Twilight Zone, my season 2 reviews, here in a couple weeks. I'm probably going to take a couple week break from this point, just to give me some time to kind of get season 2 off the ground and kind of give myself a little bit of a break, because I've been doing the bonus episodes, the Black Mirror bonus episodes, and posting these episodes. So once again, thank you guys for listening to season 1 of Anthology. We'll be back with season 2, and thank you again, Tiny, for joining me, and that'll do it for this episode. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to Anthology, presented by ObsessiveViewer.com. You can find more episodes at AnthologyPod.com, and you can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or your preferred podcast app. If you'd like to help support the podcast, please take a few minutes to leave a rating and a review on iTunes. The more reviews I get, the higher the show will be ranked in iTunes search results, making it easier for people to discover it and grow the podcast. Of course, you can always email me your thoughts and feelings about the show to matt@obsessiveviewer.com. You can also tweet me at obsessiveviewer, like the Facebook page at facebook.com/anthologypod, or you can call and leave me a voicemail at 317-762-6099 for a chance to have it played on the show. If you like what you've heard here, I urge you to check out The Obsessive Viewer, a weekly movie and TV podcast I host with my friends Mike and Tiny. Also check out the Obsessive Viewer blog at obsessiveviewer.com, where I write movie reviews, TV reviews, and the occasional editorial about the business of entertainment. If you want even more obsessive content in your life, subscribe to the Obsessive Viewer subreddit at r/obsessiveviewer, and check out obsessivebooknerd.com, our sister site for book reviews, author spotlights, and a general celebration of reading. Finally, if you're philosophically curious, check out my friend Tiny's side project podcast, The Secular Perspective, which explores the concepts of faith, religion, and existence from the perspective of secular hosts. You can find that at thesecularperspective.com. Once again, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.